Carly Fiorina writes a weekly newsletter for LinkedIn she calls Leadership Matters. And in it, she shares her experience, what she has learned through the years as a major leader at Hewlett Packard, and also through really coaching a lot of other leaders after that. And that's as part of Carly Fiorina Enterprises and Unlocking Potential. This week's newsletter is entitled, Where Are We and Where Do We Want to Go? And Carly is still with us, I'm delighted to say. So Carly, you say in the preface to your newsletter, it's critically important to ask those questions, where are we going? When you're in a crisis, it's equally important as you come out of it and you get back to normal, whatever that means, to be asking yourselves those questions.
Yes, indeed. And I actually decided to write about this week, David, because it's come up a lot in my work with clients where people have, let's face it, people have been through the ringer, right? I mean, they've been in the foxhole together for a year. This has been an incredibly unprecedented 12 months. And so the assumption is, well, we're all on the same page because we've been together through this crisis and we've Zoomed together and we've done all these things together. So, of course, we must understand where we are and where we want to go. And it turns out, as I said in the newsletter, never assume. Never assume that what you think is going on is what everyone thinks is going on. And so it's critically important to ask some really basic questions coming out of this pandemic. What did we learn? What did we learn that we should continue? What did we learn that we can do without? What is our current financial situation? How are our employees coping? A bunch of basic questions that allow people to come to a shared understanding of where are we, our current state. And then questions that can help guide where do we want to go? What are our most important innovations? Should we relook? And my advice would be yes, absolutely. Relook at the goals and the strategic plan you had in place before the pandemic and say, does this still work? Is this still accurate? Are we prioritizing appropriately? Should we be more ambitious? Should we be less ambitious? The point is, a leader needs to make the time to bring appropriate people together around a table so that everyone comes to a shared view of the current state, where are we really, and a shared view of where should we be going, the future state, so that they can execute with high performance.
And in reading your newsletter, it struck me, Carly, that there is a really interesting interplay between asking questions like, what did we learn, and the goals in the strategic plan. Because what you learned, what matters or not, in fact, depends in part on what you're trying to do. Because some things you learned matter and some things don't matter. And so it's almost impossible to have that discussion without going back to your goals and your strategy.
Exactly right, David. You know, it's hard to assess things in the short term if you don't have a long-term plan in mind. As you and I have talked about before, I'll give you an example. In my own business, we had a strategic plan to digitize a lot of our offerings and our curriculum. And the pandemic accelerated that work because we had the time to do it, because there was a greater necessity to do it. However, in the course of doing it, we learned some things that we didn't have in mind when we had that as a strategic goal initially. And so now actually we've concluded we can be more ambitious about achieving that goal, not less. But we digitized because not just the pandemic required it, but because it was part of our strategic plan going forward.
And part of your rigor is to say, okay, now that that's what we've learned, what do we want to do with that going forward? What do we keep? What do we build on? I wonder if also you have to ask yourself a difficult question, what should we unlearn? Because we had to do some things during this pandemic, so this crisis time, that maybe we don't really want to keep doing.
Exactly. And in fact, I hope I was smart enough to put that question in there, if not, or some version of that question, because you're exactly right. You know, when you're in the middle of a crisis, you let a lot of things slide so that you can focus on what's really essential. And some of that letting it slide turns into a bad habit that is damaging over time. And so getting very explicit, and I love your word rigor, David, because leaders are rigorous, they're disciplined, they're explicit, they never fly by the seat of their pants. And using a rigorous analysis and assessment to say, what did we do well, what did we not do well, what did we do that we really want to lose going forward? because it's going to hurt us in more normal times. But what did we learn that we want to carry with us going forward? Because it's going to make us better in normal times.
One of the things I really enjoy with you, Carly, is taking what applies to a corporate situation, an organization that's a corporation, even a very, very large one like Hewlett Packard, and applying it in an even larger context. You did run for president, after all. Let's apply some of those questions. Let's ask them about our country. What did we learn from this pandemic? What do we want to keep doing? What do we want to do without, do you think, coming out of this?
Yes, it's a great question. Well, one of the things I think we learned, David, I hope we learned, is that we are all connected. That, you know, it used to be maybe that some of us who are fortunate would go into the grocery store and we didn't really spend any time thinking about the essential workers stocking the shelves or the essential workers cutting the meat. And we learned we can't do that anymore. We're all connected. And if a group of people is unhealthy, we will be impacted. I think the other thing we've learned in this pandemic is that difficulty hits people differently. And in fact, we've learned that the rich got a lot richer in this pandemic. The big got a lot bigger. And the poor, the low wage worker, the small got crushed. And so we now have real structural issues in our economy going forward. Yes, growth is going to go like gangbusters and big companies are going to do great, but we have structural issues around income inequality that are serious and that will hold our economy back. We know that this pandemic hit women and people of color harder than it hit white men. That's a structural issue that will hold the economy back going forward. We know small and family-owned businesses got crushed. That's a structural issue that will hold our economy back. All of that we need to remember and we need to take care of. And finally, you mentioned infrastructure way in your lead-in. We finally need to get about doing infrastructure. We have been talking about it for a long time under Republicans and Democrats alike. We've never gotten it done. We need to actually invest in building modern 21st century infrastructure that reaches everyone.
Finally, a short leading question. Could we be learning that we want big government, and might that be the wrong lesson to learn?
I think what we're learning is that we need competent government. We actually need competent government with expertise. However, big government is just like anything else that gets too big. It cares more about itself than those they serve.